The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed by the Soviet Union and the Central Powers, was the direct result of years of inner conflict between the Russian revolutionaries and the Tsar Nicholas II. The conflict was brought on by the Tsar's poor land and food distribution and his inability to end World War I. The conflict between the revolutionaries and the Tsar ended with the Tsar's death and the Bolshevik Party taking control of Russia and making it into a Soviet state. The conflict with the Central Powers ended with a compromise when Russia gave away some of its land, including Poland and Ukraine, to appease the Central Powers and formally pull Russia out of the Great War.
On January 22, 1905, a group of workers led by Georgy Apollonowicz Gapon marched to the Tsar's Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. The Russian workers were losing morale and wanted to end the Russo-Japanese War. The Russian people wanted to confront the Tsar about the impending loss of the Russian-Japanese War. But imperial forces opened fire on the demonstrators, wounding and killing hundreds. This was the first event that started the escalating conflicts between the peoples of Russia and the Tsar.
Leading up to the revolution, 4/5 of the population in Russia were peasants. Russia also had a small middle class and were much less industrialized than other European countries at the time. Leading up to the Russian Revolution, the gap between the upper classes and the peasantry continued to grow. The Tsar himself owned 10% of Russia's farmable land. Many of the Tsar's government officials were also wealthy landowning aristocrats. The aristocrats were resistant to change and refused to compromise with the lower working class. Farming in Russia was not always easy work, and the peasants struggled to cultivate crops with outdated methods. The poor conditions of the lower class only helped to escalate the rising tensions between the nobility and the peasants of Russia.
Tensions also rose as power was given to Rasputin by Tsar Nicholas II because of his mystic powers that he supposedly used to heal his son, Alex.
Prior to the start of World War I, Russia, along with many other European countries, engaged in pacts and treaties with each other. This provided kindling for the fire that would consume Europe during World War
I. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated by Gavrilo Princip. In the following month, July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia mobilized its army, and on August 1st, 1914, Germany declares war on Russia, pulling Russia into the Great War. A significant amount of Russia's resources were diverted to fight in the war. The mechanization of warfare leading up to World War I only increased the death toll and the intense conditions of the war. Millions of Russian men were drafted to fight in the brutal trenches of Europe, and on the home front, foods and resources were constantly rationed to support the war effort. As a result, the lower classes began to grow disaffected and turned towards overthrowing the government. In St. Petersburg, where the long hatred for the Tsar erupted into mass protests against food rationing, involved violent armed clashes with police and mass demonstrations. On the 27th of February, mutinous Russian army forces sided with the revolutionaries. 3 days later, the Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, and a Russian provisional government was set up. After the February Revolution, German authorities allowed Lenin to cross Germany en route to Sweden in a railway car. Germany hoped that the revolutionists would tear down the provisional government. Lenin himself called for the overthrow of the provisional government. He was condemned as a German agent by the government's leaders, and in July he was forced to flee to Finland. But his call for peace, land, and bread, which refers to an end to food shortages and an end to unfair distribution of land among the wealthy, as well as ending Russia's participation in World War I, was met with increasing popularity, and the Bolsheviks won a majority in St. Petersburg. In October, Lenin secretly returned to Petrograd and disposed the provisional government and proclaimed Soviet rule. Lenin's plan was to bring peace to Russia and to end their participation in World War I. to give the Bolsheviks breathing room so they wouldn't have to be overwhelmed by other parties. And also, Lenin hoped that revolution would break out all over Europe after Germany is exposed as aggressors. Lenin sent out Trotsky to make peace with Germany, and Trotsky, to the surprise of the Germans, declined their peace terms, proclaiming no war, no peace. Ludendorff, Germany's quartermaster general, did not care as being seen as an aggressor, so he pushed farther east into Russia without any opposition. Ludendorff had enough of Trotsky's delaying tactics. He instructed the German delegation to present the Russians with a harsh set of peace terms on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. The Soviets voted to accept the terms, as they did not want to see any harsher punishments. The treaty was signed on March 3, 1918, and by the terms, Russia lost 1,267,000 square miles, 27% of their agricultural land, 62 million people, and 75% of the iron and steel industry in Russia. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk let the Bolsheviks have some breathing air to take care of their internal problems, such as the Russian Civil War, instead of focusing on external conflicts, such as World War I. The loss of a large amount of the Russian Imperial Empire led to the creation of more individual countries, which would later be reconquered by the Soviet Union during World War II to act as a buffer zone between Russia and Germany.
The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk successfully brought Russia out of World War I, but as a result they lost much of their western territory. The Central Powers were able to put aside their differences and compromise with the Soviet Union to end further bloodshed between them. Several decades later, the treaty would lead to more conflict when the Soviet Union ambitiously extended its borders deep into Europe. The Soviet Union's bitterness over the loss of Poland and Ukraine ultimately fueled their ambition for acquiring more land. By the end of World War II, Russia had pushed as far west as Germany and as far east as Korea. Stalin's dream of reclaiming the territory controlled by the Russian Empire led to the creation of the USSR as we remember it today. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk had long-lasting effects and implications into the mid-20th century and beyond.